Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. Sound is not passive. That's the first thing I tell clients when they hire me to assess a space, because most people think of sound as something that happens to them rather than something they participate in. A room is not a container for sound. It's a system, surfaces and volumes and materials all in relationship with each other, all doing something to every frequency that moves through the space. My job is to understand what a room is doing with sound and to advise on whether what it's doing serves the people who will be using it. I've been doing this for 15 years and I'm good at it, and the work suits the part of me that needs things to be accountable, that needs every effect to have a traceable cause. I hear things other people don't, not in any mystical sense, in the technical sense of someone who has trained her auditory attention for 15 years to register frequency and decay and spatial behavior that the average person's ear filters out as irrelevant. I notice sound. I notice when it's doing something it shouldn't. I notice when something quiet is present in a room that the room's ambient noise should be covering. That's why I heard the music box when no one else would have. My grandmother Hesse died in February at 83. She'd lived in the same house for 50 years, a modest two-story in a quiet part of the city, and she'd outlasted my grandfather by a long time, and most of her contemporaries by a shorter one. And she'd been, in all the ways I could measure, fine, right up until she wasn't. No prolonged decline, no extended goodbye. She went to bed on a Thursday and didn't wake up on Friday, and the doctor said it was her heart, which was the word the doctor used for when a person's body has simply finished. She left the house and its contents to me. I was her only grandchild, and we'd been close in the way of two people who understood each other without needing to explain themselves, which was the best kind of close. I took 2 weeks to go through the house, the way you do when someone is gone and you need to understand what they left before you decide what to do with it. The music box was on the shelf in her bedroom, between a clock and a photograph of my grandfather I'd seen there my whole life. I knew the music box the same way I knew the clock and the photograph, as furniture of the room, as part of the specific arrangement of things that meant grandmother's bedroom. I'd never paid close attention to it. It was a music box, ornate in the Victorian manner, with a hinged lid and a brass mechanism visible through the glass panel in the side. I wound it and opened it the first time while I was inventorying the bedroom. The melody was 8 notes, a short phrase descending in the second half, with an interval in the middle that I didn't immediately place in any key I recognized. It played through once and repeated twice more before the mechanism ran down. I held it at ear level and listened to the decay of the final note, the specific way the tone thinned at the end. I didn't recognize the piece. I knew a substantial amount of music and I didn't recognize it. I filed this as interesting and set the box aside and continued with the inventory. 3 nights later, sleeping in my grandmother's house while the clearance was ongoing, I woke up at 2 in the morning to the sound of the music box playing. The lid was closed. I checked immediately. It was fully closed, the latch engaged. The box was playing anyway. 8 notes, the same phrase, quiet enough that it would have been completely inaudible with any ambient noise in the room. I heard it because the house was silent and because I was trained to hear things at the threshold. I lay in the dark and listened to it finish and thought about mechanical failures in music box mechanisms that could produce spontaneous playing. There were a few theoretical explanations. None of them were convincing for a closed and latched box. I went back to sleep because it was 2 in the morning and I didn't have anything better to do with the information. The following afternoon, a fire started in a building 2 streets over. An electrical fault, the news said. 3 units damaged, no fatalities. I heard the fire engines from the house. I noted the timing in the inventory log I'd been keeping. Not because I believed anything yet, because noting things was what I did. I took the box home when I finished clearing the house. I took it because it had been my grandmother's and because I wanted it, and I took it before I found the letter, which is how I did things in the wrong order that might have been the right order if I'd been able to trust the sequence. I logged the first playing at home 3 weeks after I moved the box in. I was in my home office at 11 at night, working on an assessment report when the box played from the living room shelf where I'd put it, closed. The 8 notes, the familiar phrase. I wrote the time in my work log because it was open and it was what I had. The following morning, a water main failed under the street at the end of my block. The road was torn up for a week. A woman's basement flooded. I went back to the fire. I looked at the date and time in my inventory log from my grandmother's house. I looked at the gap between the playing and the fire. 6 hours. I started a dedicated log. Over the following 4 months, I documented 11 playings. I was able to correlate 9 of them to events I could verify. The other 2 were either correlated to events I hadn't been aware of or were exceptions to the pattern, and I filed them as inconclusive rather than disconfirming. The 9 I could verify covered a range of events: a car accident, a structural failure at a job site I'd assessed, a gas leak in a commercial building downtown, a tree falling across a road during a storm, a fall down a staircase at a house 2 blocks over that sent an elderly man to the hospital. Personal and local, as I would come to think of them. The box did not play before anything that wasn't in some geographic relationship to wherever I was. The gap between playing and event ranged from 2 hours to 14. I was building a pattern, and I knew I was building a pattern, and I knew from professional experience that pattern building was a way of creating confidence you hadn't yet earned. So I held the pattern loosely and kept logging and didn't do anything with it yet. I found the letter when I was doing a second pass through the boxes I'd brought from my grandmother's house, looking for a specific photograph I wanted to frame. It was in a small cedar box under a collection of correspondence, unsealed, addressed to me in my grandmother's handwriting. She'd written my full name on the envelope, the formal version she used when something was being said for the record. I sat down on my office floor and read it. Hesse had owned the music box for 40 years. She'd acquired it at an estate sale, which was the extent of what she knew about its origin, and she'd had it for approximately 3 years before she understood what it was doing. Her path to understanding had been slower than mine. She didn't have my auditory training. she'd heard the playing as an intermittent mechanical fault for a long time before she connected it to what followed. The letter described the moment of connection in her characteristic way, which was plainly and without drama. I heard it on a Tuesday night, and on Wednesday morning, a man on our street had a heart attack in his car. I heard it again the following week, and a gas line failed 2 blocks over. I began to keep a record. She had kept a record for 40 years. The letter described her conclusions about the box with the care of someone who had arrived at them slowly and tested them often. The box played before harmful events in the vicinity. The events ranged in severity and type. The gap between playing and event was never more than a day and never less than an hour. The box did not play before every harmful event in the vicinity. She had established this by noting events she heard about that had not been preceded by a playing, and there were enough of them to confirm that the box was selective. It played before some events and not others, and she had never determined the selection principle. Then the letter said the thing I had expected and not expected. I decided, after approximately 10 years, not to act on the playings. I made this decision carefully, and I want you to understand why I made it, because I know you, and I know you will disagree with me at first. She had tried, in the early years, to act, to use the gap between playing and event to do something. She'd evacuated herself from locations she suspected. She'd warned neighbors. She'd called non-emergency lines with concerns she couldn't explain. And twice, she wrote, her actions had been right in a way she could confirm. She had gotten herself clear of something, and the something had been real. But the selectivity of the box, the fact that it did not play before every harmful event, meant that acting on a playing was acting on incomplete information. She did not know which harmful event the playing preceded. She did not know its location, its severity, its nature. She knew only the gap. Acting on incomplete information in the vicinity of something harmful, she wrote, is how people get hurt. I know this sounds like inaction dressed as wisdom. I spent 10 years deciding whether it was. I believe it is wisdom. I believe you will need to find out for yourself. She ended the letter. I'm sorry I didn't send this. I kept meaning to wait until I had more to tell you. I didn't find more to tell you. What I've told you is all I found. I disagreed with her. I want to be straightforward about that. I read the letter and I understood her reasoning and I found it coherent, and I disagreed with it because her reasoning assumed that the gap between playing and event was too small and the information too incomplete to be useful, and I thought she might be wrong about that. I thought that with my logging and my professional capacity for acoustic analysis, with the level of attention I was capable of bringing to the playing itself, the quality of the tone, the room's response to it, any variation in the 8 notes from playing to playing, I might be able to extract information she hadn't had access to. She'd heard it with a layperson's ear for 40 years. I heard it with 15 years of trained acoustic attention. The next playing came at 7 in the evening on a Thursday. I was home. I sat completely still and listened to the 8 notes and paid attention to everything I was capable of paying attention to. Frequency, decay, the room's response, any deviation from the pattern of previous playings. There was a deviation. It was small, and I might have invented it, which I acknowledged to myself at the time. but the decay on the final note was shorter than previous playings. The way a sound decays differently in a space with an acoustic anomaly. Not a different note, not a different tempo, just a slightly different relationship between the tone and the silence after it. I thought about what produced shortened decay: absorption, proximity to an absorptive surface, soft materials, the space the sound was moving through, or the space at the origin of what the sound was preceding. I lived 3 blocks from a textile warehouse. I had walked past it that morning, and there had been maintenance workers on the exterior. I had no basis for connecting these two facts, except that I was looking for a basis, and this was what I had. I called the non-emergency line and reported a concern about the textile warehouse, citing a smell I had not smelled and a concern about electrical systems I had no basis for. I said I thought it was probably nothing, but I wanted to flag it. The dispatcher thanked me and logged it. A city inspector showed up the following morning and found an overloaded electrical panel in the warehouse that the maintenance work had stressed. It was repaired the same day. No fire, no damage. I saw the inspector's truck from my window, and I knew what it meant. I sat with that for a long time. 6 weeks later, the box played at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. I heard it from the kitchen. I sat down with my coffee and I listened. This time, I heard the deviation clearly. Not the same shortened decay as before, something different, a particular quality in the third note, a wavering at the frequency edge that I associated with humid conditions, with spaces that held moisture. I thought about the range of the playing, the radius within which the box's events seemed to occur, and I thought about moisture and an enclosed space, and I thought about the parking structure 2 streets over that had flagged drainage concerns in a building assessment report I'd written 18 months ago, and whose management company had not, as far as I knew, acted on my recommendations. I called the management company. I told them I'd been in the area and had noticed water on the exterior of the structure and was concerned about the drainage issue from my previous report. I told them I thought an inspection was warranted. They sent someone that afternoon. The inspector was walking the 3rd level when the drainage failure occurred. A section of the ceiling of the 2nd level let go. The inspector was directly below it because I had told the management company where my report had identified the primary concern, and the management company had told the inspector where to look. He was hurt, not critically, a broken arm, a concussion, lacerations, but hurt. Hurt because I had sent him to the place I'd identified as the concern, and the concern had resolved while he was standing in it. I sat in my apartment that evening and thought about what my grandmother had written. Acting on incomplete information in the vicinity of something harmful is how people get hurt. She had known. Not this event, not this specific outcome, but this shape. She had known the shape of it, and she had told me, and I had disagreed with her, and I had been right once, and then I had been this. I went back to the letter and read it again. All of it. This time sitting still with it, rather than moving through it, looking for the places where I could argue. She had tried for 10 years. She had 2 confirmed preventions she could point to, like the one I'd had at the warehouse, and she had written about them without triumph, written about them as the experiences that preceded her understanding that the 2 successes had not been proof of concept but exceptions, and that the exceptions had kept her acting longer than the pattern warranted. The box plays before some things and not others, she had written, and I don't know why it plays when it plays. I used to think the playings were the events I could do something about. I think now that the playing is not an invitation to act. It is a notification. The difference between those two things is the whole question. A notification, not an invitation. I thought about what a notification without an invitation meant for how I was supposed to live with the box. I thought about the inspector's broken arm. I thought about the warehouse and the panel I'd been right about. And I thought about whether my grandmother had held on to her two successes the way I'd held on to mine. Whether the weight of the good outcomes was what had kept her acting past the point of her first failure. She'd had 10 years of that. Then she'd stopped. I'd had 6 weeks. The box played 3 nights after the parking structure. I heard it from the bedroom at 11 at night. 8 notes. I lay in the dark and I listened, and I did not move. I stayed in bed and I let the 8 notes finish, and I let the silence after them be silence. And I did not reach for my phone, and I did not try to determine the deviation, and I did not begin the process of identifying the absorptive qualities of the space at the origin of whatever was coming. I lay there and I held still. It was the hardest thing I had done in a recent memory. Not because it was physically difficult, because I knew something was going to happen in the next 2 to 14 hours in the vicinity of wherever I was, and I knew it was going to be harmful to someone, and I was choosing to not try to prevent it. And every professional instinct I had, the instinct that made me good at finding the fault in a sound system, the instinct that made me precise about what a room was doing wrong, was pushing against the holding still. My grandmother had held still for 30 years after her 10 years of trying. 30 years of hearing the 8 notes and staying in her chair or her bed and not calling anyone and not going anywhere and not doing the thing I wanted to do. I stayed in bed. In the morning, I checked the local news and found a kitchen fire in an apartment building 4 blocks away. It had started at 2 in the morning. The building's smoke alarms had worked. Everyone had gotten out. The fire had been contained to 2 units. The alarms had worked. Everyone had gotten out. My grandmother's 30 years of holding still against the evidence that the systems that existed were sometimes sufficient, and that inserting herself into them with partial information was not always better than letting them do what they were built to do. I stayed in bed the next time, and the time after that. I kept the log because keeping the log was the discipline I had available, and it was something, even if I didn't do anything with it. I still have the box. It sits on the shelf in my office, where I can hear it from anywhere in the apartment, which is where it needs to be given what it is and what I am. It plays 6 or 7 times a month. I hear it and I log it, and I hold still. Mostly, I hold still. I won't tell you I hold still every time, because that would not be accurate, and I committed to accuracy in this account. There have been 2 more times since the parking structure when I acted. One of them resolved cleanly, and I will never know whether my acting changed anything, or whether it would have resolved the same way without me. The other one, I am not going to describe, because I am still close to it, and the account would not be accurate if I wrote it now. My grandmother's letter is in the cedar box on my office shelf, next to the music box. I read it periodically. not looking for new information. There is no new information in it, but for the tone of it, the specific tone of someone who arrived at a hard position over a long time and wrote it down for the person who would come after her. She knew I would come after her. She addressed the letter to me, specifically, and left it unsealed, where I would find it eventually, which means she decided the letter was for me and not for anyone else, and that whenever I found, it would be the right time to find it. I don't know how long she'd been sitting with it before she died, months, possibly years. She ended it with something I didn't quote earlier because I was working toward it. The box is not asking anything of you. It never asked anything of me. It plays and something follows, and the playing is not the same as the asking. I spent 10 years confusing those two things and 30 years understanding the difference. I hope it takes you less time. I think it probably will. You were always better at listening than I was. The box played while I was reading the letter for the third time, which was when I understood she was right, that I was better at listening. I held the letter in my hands and I listened to the 8 notes, and I held still and I let the notes finish. And then I sat in the silence after them for a long time. Outside somewhere, something was coming. I stayed in my chair.